cooperation, improving political dialogue, as well as expanding trade, economic, and humanitarian ties. There's going to be a significant exchange of views on both international and regional agenda, with an emphasis on cooperation within the UN and other international platforms. From July the 16th to 17th, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Azerbaijan is going to visit Russia with an official visit. He is going to hold talks with Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russia. The heads of two foreign ministries are going to talk about the current state of affairs, as well as the prospects for the development of Russian-Azeri relations, as well as a number of important regional and international issues. Starting from July the 21st to 23rd in Manila, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is going to participate in the meetings of foreign ministers under the aegis of ASEAN in the following formats: Russia-ASEAN, East Asia Summit, and the ASEAN Regional Forum. At these events, the Russian delegation is going to present its assessment through joining the potentials of ASEAN, Eurasian Economic Union, and the SCO, through building a shared space for peaceful and sustainable joint development. We believe that to be a solid foundation for a comprehensive regional system of security guarantees. The meeting between Russia and ASEAN is going to be dedicated to the outcomes of the anniversary summit, timed with the 35th anniversary of relations between Russia and ASEAN. It took place in Kazan in June. We're also going to talk about steps with a view to implementing the comprehensive plan of action to implement ASEAN-Russia strategic partnership for 2026-2030. Another emphasis is going to be the launch of new avenues of cooperation, as well as the agenda of foreign ministers. The agenda for the East Asia Summit is going to be focused on preparing the summit in Manila in November this year. An emphasis is going to be made on promoting a depoliticized dialogue and intensifying practical cooperation between the members of this association. Another priority is Russia's initiatives in epidemic response, improving tourism cooperation, as well as the implementation of other decisions endorsed by the leaders previously. At the ARF session, the program of the forum for next year is going to be adopted, as well as the Manila Plan of Action for 2026-2036, which is going to replace the old one from 2020. Important avenues include emergency response, response to terrorism, transnational crime, maritime security, disarmament, and non-proliferation, as well as ICT security. And traditionally, we advocate the practical importance of this platform, which serves mutual trust based on equality, consensus, and mutual respect for the interests of one another. And on July the 23rd, 24th, Foreign Minister Lavrov is going to travel to Chalpon-Ata, Kyrgyzstan, where he is going to attend the Foreign Ministers meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the SCO. This meeting is going to inaugurate the final step for the preparations of the SCO summit that is going to take place in Bishkek from August the 21st to September the 1st. This year, the ministers are going to look at the preparations and at the solid package of documents aimed at further developing the SCO. Those documents are going to be submitted to the leaders for endorsement. An emphasis is going to be made on the international regional agenda, especially in the SCO space, ensuring security and stability, as well as sustainable growth in Eurasia, as is tradition in the sidelines of the event. Foreign Minister Lavrov is going to hold a number of bilateral meetings. All of these events are going to be covered on the websites and our resources of the Foreign Ministry, our web portal, our official accounts for the Foreign Ministry, and social networks. Now, important national agenda, Ukraine. The Kiev Nazi regime continues its campaign of terror against civilian and civilian infrastructure with the support of its Western curators. Over the last week, 312 people have been injured, 40 have died, 1 minor, 271 have been injured, including 13 minors and teenagers. Let me cite some concrete facts. Belgorod region, from July the 9th to 14th, the strikes of the Ukrainian armed forces claimed the lives of 5 people, including a 13-year-old boy. 26 have been injured. 2 Emercom employees have died when trying to extinguish the fire after the drone strike in Bryansk region. 2 people died, including a 15-year-old girl. 7 have been injured. Donetsk People's Republic, same period, 14 people have died, including a boy born in 2016. 35 have been injured. Zaporozhye region, 6 people have died, 8 injured, including a child of 2018 and a young girl of 2006. Kursk region, in the same week, the terror of Banderites have injured 11 people. Lugansk People's Republic, from the 9th to the 15th of July, 5 people have died, including the woman in the market square in Starobelsk, as well as a 20-year-old driver of a passenger car, whereas the passengers, the girls of 18 and 20 years, have been injured. The UAV attacks have claimed the lives of 24 more people, including 4 women that were traveling in intercity buses from Kamenaya to Luhansk and from Stakhanov to Moscow. Moscow region, in the night of July the 13th, 3 people have died, 5 have been injured. Rostov region, on July the 11th, drones struck merchant vessels, claiming the life of a seaman. Samara region, on July the 12th, 3 people, including a minor, have been injured. 1 people has died. Kherson region, from the 9th to the 15th of July, 6 people died, 32 are injured, including 2 teenagers of 2009 and 2010. In Zaporozhye region and in Luhansk, the operators of the armed forces of Ukraine have been deliberately striking the same facilities, cynically interdicting a swift response and the evacuation of injured. They deliberately kill civilians and those who come to their rescue. They do that deliberately. So this is terrorism squared, or to the power of more than 2. And this will certainly entail a response, punishment. The Russian law enforcement keep collecting data to bring criminal proceedings against the Kiev regime, the fighters and the leadership of the armed forces of Ukraine. Vladimir Yamin, a fighter of the National Guard, has been condemned to 21 years in prison for attempt on a life of civilian and strikes against civil infrastructure in Donetsk in 2015. And David Kabuya, a Georgian mercenary, has been condemned to 14 years in prison in absentia. And let's look at who is supporting all of that. On July the 13th, Paris hosted the coalition of the willing, chaired by France and the UK. The hosts thought that as a summit that would condemn and we were in support of the Kiev regime by the West, and certainly Zelensky was there. He is always traveling from one such platform to another, trying to convince everyone that the armed forces of Ukraine would soon win. He calls his allies to put more pressure on Russia and to be generous in military and financial support. He wants them to pay more, to give more, but Europe, well, is not always ready to give more to this absolutely corrupt gang of thieves that is sitting in Kiev, and its terrorist nature cannot be hidden anymore because they are proudly saying about that. The joint statement has been subscribed to by the newcomers Moldova and North Macedonia. The statement speaks about the unwavering support for Ukraine as long as it takes. This is a quote. It speaks about the need for an immediate and complete ceasefire, direct talks with Russia from the position of force with active participation of European, continued freezing of Russian sovereign assets, greater sanctions pressure on Russia, greater response to the Russian shadow fleet, as they call it, allegedly in compliance with international law as well as UNCLOS. They confirm their willingness to provide the Kiev regime with politically and legally binding security guarantees that, as the statement says, would be purely defensive. At the same time, they confirm the willingness of these multinational forces for Ukraine to start rebuilding the armed forces of Ukraine and provide support to Kiev in the ground, in the air, and at sea at its request once the hostilities have been stopped durably. Not a single word of condemnation against those who kill women and children via terrorists means not a single word, not on the sidelines, nor in the press release, nor in the statement. President Macron of France says that these forces will be deployed far from the front line, and in the forthcoming months they're going to hold exercises of these forces in the areas adjacent to Ukraine's borders. We would like to once again emphasize that we find it unacceptable that any military contingents from third countries of the coalition of the willing should be deployed in Ukraine, because that would mean an international intervention as well as a growing threat to Russia. It will be seen by us as a legitimate military goal. Paris has also announced the new anti-ballistic missile coalition, including the UK, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Norway, France, and Sweden. The participants have agreed to pool their efforts together to build an integrated missile defense architecture to deter and defeat future missile threats. It emphasizes that this coalition is going to be purely defensive. This is a direct quote. The Kiev regime intends to make a significant contribution to this structure, including through their own advancements in this field. The Ukraine is going to provide its territory for the establishment of these enterprises and for testing the products, and these products are going to be tested against the population of Kiev itself, but no one is going to say that. After this meeting in Paris, President Macron has announced that they're going to provide Zelensky's regime with a license to produce Scalp cruise missiles, Aster-30 surface-to-air missiles, 4 SAMP-T multiple launchers, as well as guided air-to-surface ASM Hammer. It is emblematic where this place took place. The venue is the military compound of Les Invalides, the burial site of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. 200 years ago, he cobbled together a coalition of the European willing to conquer Russia, but he suffered a shameful defeat and he was chased from the Russian territory. Those who are planning a new mission against Russia, well, it would be worth their while to remember history and see what their expansionist plans can bring about. We advise them to stop harboring under the illusion that they will be able to deal a strategic defeat to Russia. Now, a couple of words. Well, it will take some time to talk about how these steps, the provision of weapons to the Kiev regimes, they are basically violating international law, and what it'll mean for them. I will remind you that starting from 2014, the provisions of military products to Ukraine have become an example of unscrupulousness of EU and NATO with regard to the situation in this country. Starting from 2022, Kiev has been receiving most lethal systems, including armored vehicles, aircraft, man-parts, anti-tank missile systems, artillery, including multiple rocket launchers, and long-range missile systems. During this time, the West has been drifting away from the OSCE principles in the field of responsible conduct in weapons transfer to conflict zones. Even though they supported those principles in the first place, I refer to the following documents. First, the 1993 CSCE principles governing conventional arms transfers, the 2000 OSCE document on small arms and light weapons. Both documents include not a declaration of intent, but rather obligations, commitments, saying that the members will refrain from transferring arms that could be used for the violation or suppression of human rights and fundamental freedoms if they could threaten the national security of other countries, prolong or aggravate an existing armed conflict, introduced a destabilizing military potential to a certain region, be misused by the recipient country, or can be re-exported in contravention to the purposes of the present documents, be used for the purposes of repression, or be used for supporting or encouraging terrorism. And now 3 exclamation marks. And support or encourage terrorism. The same applies for the OSCE principles for export controls of man-parts. That document goes back to 1994 and was updated by the decision of the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation back in 2008, when giving an export license for man-parts, the OSCE members have to take into account the potential for diversion or misuse of man-parts in the recipient country, the recipient government's ability and willingness to protect against unauthorized retransfers, loss, theft, or diversion of man-parts, adequacy and effectiveness of physical security arrangements taken by the recipient government. All of these provisions significantly restricted the possibilities of provisions of arms and military equipment to Ukraine, and that is why for many years now the West has been hypocritically pretending that it has allegedly no relation whatsoever to the situation in the country and around it, even though in truth the West certainly knew that the armed units of Ukraine have been using all their munitions and forces since 2014 to mass shell cities. Before the beginning of the special military operation, this was mumbled by the special monitoring mission of the OSCE. In the recent months, many of the weapons have been using with the endorsement of the specialists of the provision countries.
Given that, the statements of those who supply weapons to Ukraine look exceptionally cynical, namely, allegedly they do not have verified information about terrorist strikes of the Ukrainian armed forces on civil infrastructure in Russian cities, deliberate shellings of residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, and hospitals, and this mumbling that we've been constantly hearing in the UN Secretariat from various representatives of various levels. We see this slow reaction in other international institutions like the OSCE and other agencies of the United Nations that have to make an immediate feedback response to the terrorist attacks by the Kiev regime, as well as strikes on nuclear facilities. I'm talking about NPPs. As for human rights and the freedom of speech, and what little remains of them, I'm not even talking about that. That should be broadcast 24/7 from such entities as the OSCE, UNESCO, many other human rights watchdogs. They should have been talking about this 24/7, talking about their indignation about what is happening in Ukraine regarding human rights. For some reason, we're not hearing all that. How come? Because it is violating specific obligations by Western countries, and if these violations are recorded, there will be responsibility that should be assumed. Let me remind you that all the strikes against civil infrastructure are taking place daily. They use various remote mining or weapon systems, combat drones, cluster munition, booby traps that were produced by NATO countries, among other things. The 155mm NATO caliber for several years has been one of top 3 main weapons to kill and to injure population in the frontline territories over the past period. They used 227mm guided rockets to strike Russian civilians, as well as ATACMS missiles and other ammunition. Against this backdrop, the sponsors and providers of weapons that are used by the Ukrainian armed forces for terrorist strikes on civilian targets hype on international platforms and threaten to have military strikes between Russia and NATO if they imagine some kind of Russian UFO in the skies. We see flagrant double standards. Incursion of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kursk region in August 2024 that was accompanied by crimes against civilians in Russia was carried out with the support of the West, and it was something that engaged the use of various equipment and weapons, IFVs produced in the US, Germany, Sweden, armored personnel carriers from the US, France, armored vehicles from the US, Italy, and Canada. The relevant Russian authorities record various facts that Western weapons were used against civilians. And another side of Western supplies of weapons is that it could fall for illegal trafficking. That's what we've been talking about for many years. These weapons could fall into the hands of nationals, terrorists, and thugs, not only in Ukraine but outside Ukraine. In Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Middle East, Ukrainian media outlets repeatedly noted that their compatriots and foreign dealers want to cash in on these arms supplies. And over the past years, we've seen skyrocketing increase in the number of crimes, 24-fold increase in the number of crimes committed with the use of illegal weapons and munitions. According to Western experts, these impact, a significant impact in the growth of the illegal trafficking in arms is made possible due to the level of corruption in the Ukrainian leadership, due to lack of accountability and lack of control. For instance, when it comes to the US, well, it comes as no surprise that the US has launched a special investigation to see how these weapons are being misused. Therefore, the West ignores, the Kiev regime ignores the major OSCE principles regarding transfer of conventional weapons, and by doing so, Ukraine basically turned into one of the key centers of international black market for weapons. The West turns a blind eye to the Kiev use of weapons in violation of the international humanitarian law, and it has a destabilizing effect. At the same time, the OSCE has blocked a dialogue on preventing illegal trafficking in arms and munition. Arms supplies are one of the impediments for the Ukrainian settlements. We do remember the self-incriminating statements by Joseph Borrell. Without Western supplies, allegedly, the conflict in Ukraine could be ended in a couple of days, weeks, or months' time. That's what he said. If Western OSCE member states genuinely want to put an end to this standoff, they simply need to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. But we are seeing what's happening, and let them not hide behind these talks on peace. Let them speak directly what they want. They want to have this aggression. Let's take a look at what's happening in Ukraine under this mentorship. The Kiev regime finds it difficult to hide the critical number of losses on the front line. There are growing public calls to ratchet up the mobilization, and there's the active preparation going on that soon conscription age will be lowered. Those who failed to flee the country or to bribe the military commissioners, those who do not wish to die for the Zelensky junta, they are simply being disposed of on the front line. Some of them do not even live before they are dispatched to the combat units. And the scale of the mayhem is evidenced by recent revelations of Ukrainian Commissioner Dmitry Lubinets regarding horrible way the conscripts are being treated. They're being heavily beaten by military commissioners. They're even being killed, and the evidence has been hidden. This begs the question, what will they do with Lubinets? Will he be able to talk about that further on, or those who wanted to save their compatriots from this mass murder, they've seen this fate when they had to repent? Will Lubinets follow their suit? The Ukrainian media outlets report there's a significant ratcheting up of draft deferment requirements. For instance, the Counselor of Ukrainian Presidential Office, Victoria Strahova, proposed to deprive the deprived leaders of critical enterprises of draft deferment if they do not observe the mandatory minute of silence at 9 o'clock. At the same time, according to the Ukrainian Institute of there's been a significant loss, and the Verkhovna Rada has seen a significant decrease in the mobilization rate. According to representatives of Ukrainian law enforcers or law representatives, 1 to 2 million persons are hiding from mobilization. The majority of them have left the country. As for the ways to improve the situation, they talk increasingly about lowering down the recruitment age up to 22 years, or even better, and there are some voices that talk about this in the Bankova, to lower it to 18. At the same time, reportedly, in exchange for the EU loan worth 90 billion euros, the Kiev regime undertook to increase the number of recruiters and agreed on the mechanism with Brussels to return Ukrainians from Europe that will be welcomed in Ukraine by the officers, conscription officers. What is that, you might ask? Is it a genocide made by Zelensky, the genocide of the Ukrainian people? There is no better description of this heinous tragedy. When Ukrainians, the citizens of Ukraine, believed the words of a person that talked so much about democracy and the rule of law, and he was sweet-talking about peace and coexistence of people of various ethnicities, talking various languages in the territory of one united Ukraine. They believed him, and now he is playing the game that he loves so much and that he loved in his childhood, the butchery. All this talks about lowering down the conscription age in Ukraine to the age of 18 and increasing the numbers of conscripts. This is not just idle talk. According to Polish sources, the EU intends to introduce changes to the temporary protection directive to hasten up the rules for the entry of Ukrainians that are to be conscripted. From now on, those who wish to come to the EU should provide with a certificate on the deferment, and this requirement would also cover women. Should this be adopted, this will be entered into force in March 2027. A month ago, former Prime Minister of Poland, Morawiecki, said, and I quote, "We're supplying tanks to you, and you are supplying your blood to us." Mind you, this is a senior politician that used to be the Prime Minister of Poland. And he said, I quote,
которую я, то есть Моровецкий, проводил с самого начала. Вы, он говорит это украинцам, расплачиваетесь своей кровью, а мы, то есть, сказал Моровецкий, поляки, старой техникой. Конец цитаты. Выйти хоть на какие-то сборища а-ля мини-майданы, просят об одном.
Like mini Maidans, they only have one demand, not to have better food, get a sleep. They have only one demand, to still live, so that their fathers, their brothers and sisters, wives could live on, as well as mothers, so that they could get this chance to live as they wish. That's what they've been pleading and asking, and I'm asking these ideologues of Maidan, don't you think that you had your ideology backfired on you? Have you been calling for that, for the monarchy to shape your future following the Maidan revolution? That's the kind of fate that you have right now. The street campaigns in Lvov were suppressed due to the units of security forces of Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine is so tragic, actually. You do recall that President Obama called to various political figures, heads of state and government, and he asked to influence the legitimate president of Ukraine, former President Yanukovych, so that he would not use force to suppress Maidan. This was back in 2013 and 2014. You might not recall that, but I do remember that. He promised that Washington would use its diplomacy and all its connections, and if legitimate president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, does not use force to suppress Maidan, to ensure this natural constitutional norm in the streets of his country, in this case, everything will go smoothly and the situation will get back on track as needed, and definitely the West will help the parties to the conflict to reach an agreement. The president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, did not use force back in the day. He believed the West, and the West proved him wrong. He thought, how come, since the president of the US, then President Obama, makes a promise, he will live up to it definitely, and he didn't use force to suppress this revolution by law according to the constitution. Despite of the mayhem that happened on the streets of Ukraine, what it all ended up with, the seizure of power, usurping of power, a lack of statehood, corruption, disruption of everything, rewriting of history, ignoring the norms and traditions, basic morality, and this heinous civil standoff, as well as butchery. And now they do not want, and they do not know how to conscript even more younger boys and girls to this butchery. Interestingly enough, when people try to remember something that they have been imposed upon, namely the ideals of Maidan, to take to the streets and to defend their lives, the very West has been applauding and encouraging the use by Kiev of all possible means of force against its own population, primarily its own army.
Так называемых бунтовщиков.
The so-called rioters who were seized were brought to their knees, as they used to do to those who had been declared enemies of Ukraine. Remember the Berkut who were brought to their knees, and the very same guys, I think, they were jumping in joy, saying that they had deserved that because they were called Muscovites. But right now, to their knees were brought those who had mocked the so-called Muscovites and who had been singing along all those old slogans, those who chose to stay silent when the flags and placards were flying over their cities, bearing the images of Nazi collaborators, those who silently watched the demolition of monuments to the founders of Odessa in particular, and now these people have been brought to their knees due to one single fact, because they had asked to spare their lives. And they were asking not those who they saw as enemies, those who they saw as their legitimate leaders. When the elements are unleashed and cloud your consciousness, you've got to remember history at that very moment. So these people have been brought to their knees. They have been made to repent before the members of the conscription officers, and all of them are showing the example of what is going to happen to those who follow their suit. They are threatened with being sent to the front lines, but it's very hard for the Kiev regime to threaten the population with repressions, because rank-and-file Ukrainians have been fed up with constant denigration and humiliation. They want to send to the front lines those conscription officers who have thrown aside all restraints. They no longer think about the lofty ideals. They have to think about what they have to think, because the authorities tell them to from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. now. They only think about their lives, and that's all they're thinking about that. If the Kiev regime had no restraint whatsoever, outside restraint, they would gladly send the whole population of Ukraine to the front line. Little does it matter that in 2 to 3 days there would be no population left whatsoever, because the people are not ready for that. But the people in Ukraine realize that, and they're trying to do as little as save their own life. Even though it seems to me that the citizens of Ukraine who are being forcefully pushed into this meat grinder, a favorite of Zelensky's, they would gladly send all the officers of conscription officers and the very kind of usurpers of power with Zelensky at the helm. They would send them to the front line. Another thing, recently there's been a photo of a fresco with the image of Stepan Bandera in the Immaculate Conception Cathedral of the Holy Mother of God of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Ternopil, and a stained glass with the image of the father of the head of the Ukrainian insurgent army, Andrei Bandera, in the Uniate Church in Kozov, the very same Ternopil region. These are new gods of this regime. This is basically neo-paganism to the power of 2. In the past, neo-paganism was on the ascendancy in Ukraine, but back then it was something of a traditional belief that had existed in those territories before Christianity. But these are no longer the spirits of nature adored by people in the past. Right now, the new gods are these Nazi scum. I do not think the Nazis themselves would have come up with a similar idea, with a better idea back in the 30s. The journalists who've traveled to the region have confirmed that these images are genuine. This is a systemic phenomenon, even though not everyone in Ukraine shares that ideology, and that is why the social networks have seen a surge of debates and discussions. Most comments are condemning this. One of the authors says that such images in a church, that is basically schizophrenia. I quote. In Poland, there have been similar sentiments. They believe that the images of Nazi killers hanging in churches in Ukraine show that Ukraine worships the devil, not God. My question is, is it really only happening now? Did they not realize that 4 years ago, when they've been pumping this Kiev regime full of weaponry, did it not occur to them that this was not in line with God's will? Did they give no thought to that whatsoever? And when they were doing that back in 2014, when the illegal coup d'etat happened, were they not asking the same questions of Sikorsky and others? Did they not ask the question of what this would bring about, what this would result in? You know, revolutions devour their authors, and people believe that someone else will arrive in power, someone better, someone noble, someone who is going to repent. But this is not happening here. Those who've come to replace the authors of those Maidans have proven to be even more catastrophic. They have proven to be great admirers of Bandera. They are the very ending that had been ministering to the spiritual needs of the Maidan participants. But it's not just the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, it's also the schismatic Orthodox Church of Ukraine, set up by the former President Petro Poroshenko in December 2018. In 2019, the self-proclaimed Metropolitan Epiphanius visited Lvov National Agrarian University. That was 7 years ago or so. He said, among the graduates of the university, I would like to remember in particular the genius. So this person called himself a metropolitan, and he said, we have to remember the genius of the Ukrainian national spirit and national identity, Stepan Bandera. He said, this Epiphanius, that Bandera is a great graduate of your university, and when we're called Banderites, he said, we take pride in that. That is what he said. That is the end of the quote. I thought Christian metropolitan bishops would be proud when they called Christians, Orthodox Christians in this particular case. But it turns out they're proud when they're called Banderites, which only reveals what kind of Christians they are. We have taken note of the words of the head of the Ukrainian State Service for Ethnic Policy and Freedom of Conscience, Viktor Yelensky. He gave an interview to a Ukrainian internet channel. He said that very probably the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church would file a complaint to the European Court of Human Rights, which would be granted. He didn't say a word about persecutions against the church. He said that Kiev does not allow for any violations of the freedom of conscience or belief, and he does not recognize that the 2024 law does not seek to eliminate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This Zelensky said that their only goal is to limit one single church, and that is the Russian Orthodox Church. Other churches are not being restricted, nor are they suffering from any persecutions. That is what Zelensky said. And they didn't give the floor to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. July the 10th, Kiev District Administrative Court has started proceedings on the action of the Kiev Diocese of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church against the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine with regard to the legitimacy of the establishment of the said service. The preliminary hearings have been scheduled for August the 27th, July the 22nd. The 6th Appellate Administrative Court will hear the countersuit of the State Service of Ukraine against the Kiev Diocese with the demand that this religious structure should be dismantled, its property given to the state. All these facts show how important it is to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and remove the threats emanating from its territory, as the Russian leadership has said. All these goals will be observed. This is not all on Ukraine. On July the 22nd, a report is going to be presented on the crimes of the Kiev regime against Russian civilians of the city of Konstantinovka. It's been drafted by the International Public Tribunal on the crimes of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, chaired by Maxim Grigoriev. We often cite these reports. It was established, this court, in 2022 during the conference dedicated to the crimes of Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass in 2014-2022. There are people from 35 countries of the world who are collecting documents related to the crimes of the Kiev regime. They are giving that to national law enforcement, present that at international Russian platforms, just as all materials presented before. This report is a fruit of meticulous work for collecting and verifying information. All facts have been verified and corroborated by witnesses, and like the Bucha stage debacle, in this particular case, each crime has the names of relatives and those who suffered. We have evidence of hunts against civilians with the use of UAVs, the hunts organized by the military of the Ukrainian armed forces, the deliberate killings during the evacuation, deliberate shellings of houses and civilian infrastructure, as well as overt manifestations of hatred for the Russian-speaking population of the city of Konstantinovka. The report is going to be presented on July the 22nd at 11 p.m. at the Russia Today Press Center, Moscow time. I would very much recommend to those who would like to learn more about the facts, who are interested in real state of affairs in Ukraine, those foreign journalists accredited at the Russian Foreign Ministry. I would like to recommend that you should visit and familiarize yourselves with the facts. You have to understand what kinds of barbarous people are now in Bankovaya. And another thing, the official press release of the Office of the Public Prosecutor General of Germany published an indictment against Ukrainian Sergei K. on the charge of blowing up Nord Stream 1 and 2 in September 22 in the Baltic Sea. The indictment says that he and his perpetrators, being military, were instructed by the government of Ukraine to organize and perpetrate this terrorist attack. The defendant is indicted with conspiracy in a military crime, including an attack on a civilian facility, sabotaging it with explosives, dismantling construction facilities, and destroying a facility of public importance. German authorities have refused to participate in a joint investigation with the Russian law enforcement in violation of treaties on mutual aid, legal assistance, but it's hard. That is why it is very hard to speak about the impartiality of German justice and investigative commissions. But the Russian side has always insisted that not just the perpetrators, but also those who commissioned the terrorist attack should be brought to account. I would like to once again address the Western authorities. It's not enough, they say, to know who the perpetrators are. And I would like to return this quote to them. You also have to understand who commissioned that. I would also like to remind you that Denmark and Sweden, in his exclusive zones, the pipelines were blown up, had been pretending to conduct an investigation, and then they simply washed their hands, handing over the evidence to the German side, and all of that despite the terrible environmental damage to the Baltic Sea due to the emissions of hundreds of thousands of tons of methane. Greta Thunberg stays silent. You don't need Greenpeace here. there is no interest whatsoever in the environmental damage that has been done. When a tanker was traveling, it could be surrounded, it could be boarded, all under the guise of the fight for the environment. Civil infrastructure construction was disrupted. They were allowed to cry out and dance and prevent the construction. They were allowed to say that no roads should be built in Russia because the environment was suffering. But in this particular case, the environment has suffered enormous damage, which is probably unprecedented. Well, setting aside the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. But speaking about peacetime, I think there can hardly be any similar example of greater damage dealt to the environment of the Baltic Sea by anything else. These terrorist attacks have dealt the greatest damage. And the Nordic countries, Denmark and Sweden, who seem to be at the forefront of this fight for the environment, seem to keep mum. Where are your NGOs? Where are your organizations fighting for the environment? We can see where they are. They were prohibited from doing that. Maybe they got some money. They were told not to show any interest. This indictment of the Prosecutor General's office emphasizes that only Nord Stream 1 alone accounted for 50% of Germany's needs in natural gas, which is very interesting. So their logic says that a certain Ukrainian citizen, Sergei K., simply out of the blue carried out a military crime, but he also made an attempt on the very welfare and well-being of the German economy, as well as the well-being of the population of the engine of the European Union. He did that on his own, it seems. So we are witnessing a schizophrenic situation. The Prosecutor General's office of the country is accusing a military of the armed forces of Ukraine of blowing up the gas pipelines at the behest of Ukrainian authorities, whereas the official authorities of Germany itself keep robbing their own population and transferring dozens of billions of euro to the very Kiev regime, which, according to their own conclusions, had been in conspiracy, in conclusion with Sergei K., with a view to dismantling the German economy and dealing economic damage to it. This is not just the theatre of the absurd, this is a theatre of the absurd going on a world tour.
According to our classical authors, in every investigation, the main thing is not to expose yourself. Well, the author of this sentence could be various, actually. There are a number of options, but still, if the mentors expose themselves, if they study various journalist investigations, actually they expose themselves, but they should keep up with this. They should follow this trace, and it would be interesting how it ends up with. They can study once again the investigation by Seymour Hersh. By the way, it took almost 4 years for Germany to have this so-called investigation of the sabotage at pipelines and to point the fingers at someone. Let me remind you that so far they only found one person over these 4 years. Let me also remind you that within 24 hours or within a week, Germany, NATO countries, and this Western minority accused all our country, all our people, all state authorities, accused of crimes that nobody knew about. They presented no materials whatsoever, and they did it in a couple of days' time. That is interesting, don't you think? Incidentally, let me remind you about the provocation in Bucha and the way anti-Russian sanctions were introduced. This was made instantly, and it doesn't matter that they don't have real names, it doesn't matter that they don't have eyewitnesses, it doesn't matter that there are no families of victims. That is not important. They had their investigation, they imposed sanctions, they had this media hype, and they constantly repeated. The UN Secretariat connives at that. The UN Secretariat led by Antonio Guterres, so far he didn't even bother to answer the questions raised by Minister Lavrov on this matter. Therefore, we will seek an open and unbiased investigation. The situation in Moldova, the authorities of this country, in this anti-Russian zeal, continue to propagate new fake news about our country. On the 9th of July, the head of Information and Security Service of Moldova accused Russia without any evidence of some clandestine subversive activities to breed loyal public and political figures that should provide and promote Russian interests that are at odds with Moldovan interests. We have no doubt that this is just another clumsy attempt to distract the public attention from another corruption scandal in the country. It resulted in the resignation of the Prime Minister and the looming governmental crisis in Moldova. Let me remind you about the pretext. Namely, the accusations were triggered by the investigation of pro-Western Moldovan media outlets about the fake CV of a head of state enterprise, Moldatsa, that is in charge of security of flights and national airspace. Then there were media leaks regarding the sky-high revenues of one of the employees of this company that proved to be a cousin of Sandu. According to journalists, she got generous reward from funds of one of the grand project that was funded by the EU. Journalists took note of other well-positioned members of the presidential family of Sandu. And after that, our country is accused of these sabotage activities. Nothing undermined the situation in Moldova more than Maya Sandu's coming to the office along with the EU thugs. Let me once again say that everything that they accuse our country of, well, it just distracts the public from this atrocious scandal unfolding in Moldova. Incidentally, there was another scandal. On the 6th of July, the Defense Ministry of Moldova committed a historical forgery in a publication dedicated to the Day of Memory and Remembrance Day of the victims of the Soviet regime. And to illustrate these victims of Stalinism, they used a photo. You wouldn't believe that. To make it even more convincing, so that there would be nobody indifferent to sow hatred between the peoples to the limit, to the max. This was a picture of victims, Jews from the Transcarpathia, Jews that were taken by the Germans to Auschwitz camp. This is the kind of nationalism that is deeply rooted in revanchism, that is feeding in everything bad, and hence you get these results, this vulgar and heinous attempt to falsify history through forgery, and through this trying to trigger emotions. We have recently exposed these materials in the special section, and I think that you love this section, the anti-fake news. There was a broad public outcry about the media information regarding the plans of Moldovan authorities to open in Sherpene settlement of the waste management center, namely the garbage site. Let me remind you that in this very village, and you would get what I mean, we're not talking about garbage and problems. Every country has its own difficulties related to this topic. We're not talking about environment, red tape, corruption. We're talking about a different, more frightening thing. This village is a home to Sherpeno foothold dedicated to the memory of 12,000 Soviet soldiers that died during a brilliant Yask-Kishinev offensive operation of the Red Army in August 1944. That is bold. They have such a twisted mind to invent this thing, to come up with establishing a waste management center in the memorial site for people that dedicated their lives, that sacrificed their lives. They continue to mount pressure on Gagauzia. On the 9th of July, the Constitutional Court of Moldova deprived the autonomy on the right to organize election. It is a blow on democracy. And was it made by Russia? Not at all. This is the Sandu regime that is destroying something that's been establishing and developing for decades, namely the friendship between the people's peaceful coexistence, democratic principles of Moldova. And this decision was perceived in the region as a direct infringement on the autonomy. The country is increasingly concerned about the ongoing militarization of Moldova. On the 30th of June, the MOD of Moldova declared the signing of the framework agreement with the Defense Investment Center of Estonia and the contract to procure over 100 units of armored vehicles that were produced in Canada. Are they going to collect crops with that? The funding of over 50 million euros will be carried out through the European Peace Facility that sponsors butchery in Ukraine. And another trigger is the situation with Russian citizens that try to enter or leave the country. They are being bullied by the customs services, by the border control services. They have many hours of groundless checks and inspections. Some criminal cases are initiated. Moldova is not safe for travel, and we kindly ask our citizens to take this into account. Moldovan political scientists openly say that the corruption became a trademark of the Chisinau regime, and the results of the June social survey opinion poll states that 70% of Moldovans believe that the authorities pursue their vested interests, and the 65% believe that the elites are hiding the truth. But looks like that officials in Chisinau are not bothered about that. If something goes wrong, Russia is to blame. You know what they say constantly. Venezuela, in line with the order by the Russian president, Caracas received 2 aircraft of the Russian MOD carrying humanitarian aid for the population of Venezuela that suffered from the devastating double earthquake on the 24th of June. Venezuelans received tents, medication, food essential, and the country also received experts in epidemiological control. A number of private companies from Russia are engaged. Our embassy is also doing its part. We thank Venezuela for kind words for the humanitarian assistance. We note that this tragedy received public outcry all around the world, and we hope that due to active international efforts where our country is participating, the earthquake and the disaster will be mitigated, and we'll continue to provide friendly support. We got a lot of questions to comment on the situation in the Persian Gulf, given the recent developments in the region, and a great number of questions from Russian and foreign journalists. I would like to give the general response to all of the questions. We are concerned about the renewed hostilities in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf. The situation is unpredictable, which is putting at risk peaceful conflict resolution. We regret the fact that resuming confrontation took place when the Islamabad Memorandum opened up prospects for diplomatic efforts. This was the result of active work by Pakistani and Arab mediators. They worked to achieve a result. We shouldn't let their results be undermined. We call on all the parties to abandon confrontation logic, to get back to the negotiating table. They need to realize that the escalation in response to escalation is not viable. It affects civilian population of all the parties involved, their economy, swift and unimpeded functioning of strategic waterways, and it undermines global economy. The main victims are the most violent cities, and this negative scenario of the developments in the Gulf undermines the priority task of settling the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. It has negative geopolitical repercussions. This is a alarming development that makes us believe that there is no prospect in forceful means, and there is no reasonable alternative to the political settlement. A decisive role should be played by the countries of the region. I'm talking about the countries of the Gulf, of the Persian Gulf, Arab countries, and naturally Iran. They have the final say in establishing an inclusive and credible security architecture in the region. And the task of external stakeholders is not to fan the flames of confrontation between the regional stakeholders, but to help them move towards peace. That's what Russia has been doing. We are open to working with any constructive partners to achieve sustainable stability. We once again recall that in order to address this primary task, we came up with an updated concept of ensuring collective security in the Persian Gulf. We updated it in May this year. We call on immediate ceasefire and resuming dialogue in order to find ways to solid peace in the region, and we intend to facilitate that in our contacts with all the parties involved. And another area, unlike the Middle East, it gave us hope for peaceful future, but currently it's not just the bone of economic contention, but unfortunately it is the area of militarization, the Arctic. Lately, we've been recording growing conflict potential in this region. We have repeatedly drawn the attention of the global public to that. The region that for many years had this prime principle, high latitude, low tension, due to NATO efforts, it has been consistently turning into an area of geopolitical standoff. Under the NATO auspices, there's been dozens of large-scale exercises. Navy forces of NATO continue regular single and grouped warship and submarine deployment in high latitudes. We see their growing presence in northern seas. In February 2026, they decided to launch the Arctic Sentry operation, and we have repeatedly commented on that. This is the operation that primarily seeks to deter Russia and China in the Arctic, as well as to build military presence of NATO close to our northern borders. NATO is committed to further confrontation in the Baltic and Scandinavian region, and that is evidenced by the arrangements of the NATO Ankara summit in July 2016 to increase commitment of 11 European NATO countries and Canada to ensure deterrence and security in the Baltic, in North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. Let me remind all of them for them to ensure security, for instance, in the Baltic Sea, probably they should sponsor less those who carry out terrorist attacks in the Baltic Seas. And there is no doubt who this new shindig is aiming against by mounting their militarist capabilities. They do not want to fight against terrorism that is
усилиями киевского режима. Они собираются бороться с мирными гражданами и с мирными странами, и с мирными народами. Указанные шаги Североатлантического блока существенно повышают риск возникновения непреднамеренных инцидентов, которые могут иметь самые негативные последствия для региона. Йемен с озабоченностью воспринимает
are not vaccinated. At the same time, there's a high rate of neonatal mortality, 33.1 cases per 1,000 births. Sorry for providing these statistics, precise figures, but it is hard for me to talk about this in a mundane way, but still we have to provide this statistical data. This is twice as much as the general indicator in the world, and the mortality rate is due to low breast milk intake. And the main reason behind this crisis humanitarian situation is the unprincipled politicization of the international assistance by the collective West. The U.S. has this ultimatum demands. They seek to introduce the Western-style democracy in Afghanistan. They pursue this clumsy policy of sanctions, and they strike not the regime but the most vulnerable population groups, children, the infants.
Сокращаются объемы международного финансирования.
The funding for humanitarian programs in Afghanistan is decreasing internationally. The legal seizure of the Afghan bank assets by the West deprives the government of the opportunity to fund anti-crisis measures. We would like to ask the proponents of democracy, as it were, to get back the assets belonging to the Afghan people and stop artificially politicizing the humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. Russia, in its stead, will continue providing humanitarian assistance via international structures. On July the 7th, the Kingdom of Tonga has joined the CDP CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, becoming the 179th country that has ratified the treaty. Russia welcomes this step, which is a step towards rendering the CTBT universal and ensuring it enters into force as early as possible. At the same time, this dynamics is overshadowed by the U.S. policy, which has been preventing the CTBTO from entering into force for many years, even though it was one of the initiators of this treaty. This position of Washington's is a direct manifestation of its arrogance and neglect by American side with regard to international law, in particular in terms of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Initiating such documents or participating in their elaboration, the U.S. in the end does not want to have its hands tied by these commitments, even though it requires that others should rigorously follow these obligations. This is basically their exclusivity in action. They do not want to be part of the treaties they ask others to be part of. The news of the handover of the letters of ratification from the Kingdom of Tonga to the depositories is particularly encouraging against the backdrop of the emerging departure of the White Sea from their previous position with regard to the nuclear tests, because the statements of the American leader and other high-level officials from the administration who said they did not rule out the possibility of resuming nuclear tests is basically a challenge to those who hold dear the goals and tasks of the CTBTO. This is also an alarm signal to those who continue to follow the CTBT. We would like to continue to ensure further stability of CTBTO, and we are willing to join our efforts together with others who share our attitude. We spoke about that before, but I would like to mention that once again. On July the 10th, we learned about the desecration of the Soviet honor field next to the city of Leusden, the Netherlands, which is the burial site of 865 Red Army soldiers who were prisoners of the Nazi concentration camps. Around 150 gravestones were defaced. The leadership of the memorial filed a complaint to the police. Right now an investigation is underway. I would like to dwell a little bit more on the history of this compound for you to better understand the full measure of cynicism and lack of morality of this crime, not an incident. This memorial cemetery of the Red Army soldiers in the city of Leusden was inaugurated on November the 18th, 1948. Most of those who buried there from the Soviet Union are prisoners of war, tortured to death at the nearby transit camp Amersfoort. Among them, 77 Red Army soldiers shot to death by Hitler troops on April the 9th, 1942, which was the largest scale war murder of POWs in the territory of the Netherlands. This tragedy is instructive because the Nazi propaganda wanted to use the Soviet POWs in its purposes. In September 1941, 101 POWs from the Red Army were brought to the railway station at Amersfoort, where cattle was usually unloaded. The soldiers were clothed in rags after a long travel in the train. They were ragged, covered in filth and hungry. The Germans hoped that the outward look of the POWs would convince the people of the Netherlands that the Third Reich, as they said, was fighting subhumans. That is the term they were using. And the metaphor about the Garden of Paradise and the savage jungle is very applicable here. But the effect was the obverse, and the Dutch doubted not the humanity of the Soviet POWs, rather they doubted the humanity of the Nazis that were mistreating them. Just one fact: during the first 6 months, more than 25% of POWs died of hunger, mistreatment, and diseases, and the doctor of the camp decided to keep 2 skulls in his office as some exotic mementos. On March the 8th, 2025, the memorial site opened a museum dedicated to the Second World War and the fate of the Red Army. It was a joint project of Russia, the Netherlands, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan to perpetuate the memory of the great feats of Soviet soldiers who were tortured to death in Nazi camps and buried in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, this is not the first act of vandalism against the Soviet honor field. In 1967, in September, some gravestones were defaced with German slogans. There was no a single doubt back then that it was the Nazis that survived the war who did that, because just little time, it was not long after the Great Patriotic War. But even in the 21st century, Nazis still have their followers. In November, December 2021, vandals defaced the stele as well as some of the gravestones and walls with neo-Nazi slogans and symbols of the Azov terrorist armed nationalist unit of Ukraine. The desecration of this burial site was already condemned by Dutch Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister Dilan Yeşilgöz. She said these actions were absolutely unacceptable. At the same time, we have to understand that recently the Netherlands and the EU have been fueling the flames of anti-Russian hysteria. They were pursuing the policy of rewriting the history of the Second World War, which created the favorable environment for such barbarous acts. I would also like to remind the Dutch authorities of the words placed on the official website of the Soviet honor-filled foundation by the journalist from Amersfoort, Remco Reding. Thanks to his efforts, more than 150 families of the former Soviet Union have learned where their relatives are buried. The words are the following. This website says, the Soviet Union has made a terrible sacrifice in the fight against Nazi Germany, and yet 865 soldiers who perished and buried in the Soviet honor field were forgotten. Their memory fell victim to after-war policy, and right now this memory is suffering due to the conflicts raging in different parts of the world. End of quote. One should not say, I'm talking about the Dutch authorities and the EU, well, they say they're sorry, this crime will be investigated, but they have to speak about the original causes, the root causes, the crimes of rewriting history. We expect the Dutch authorities to investigate as soon as possible this incident, which we call a crime. We want those responsible found and brought to justice, and this memorial has to be restored, and probably the guards should be strengthened. The Russian embassy in The Hague is in close contact with the Dutch authorities as well as with the leadership of the memorial conflict to investigate the crime and rebuild it. Now, several anniversaries. Just recently, on July the 11th, 2006, Monaco and Russia exchanged notes which endorsed the establishment of diplomatic ties. This was a logical continuation of a great history of mutual interest and sympathy. The Russian Seasons wrote a great page in the history of the Principality of Monaco. Right now, the Principality of Monaco, which positioned itself as a sovereign, pragmatic country outside of any blocs, right now it is unreservedly and pointedly following the suit of the collective West, basically becoming an accomplice of all anti-Russian initiative. It has fully abandoned its own interests and the principles of neutrality. Monaco has not just formally signed on to European sanctions, it is also pursuing these sanctions with particular zeal. It freezes the assets of Russians. It has fully severed cultural and humanitarian ties. It is acting in unfriendly nature towards Russia. So it is no longer an independent, self-sufficient agent of international actor. It is an obedient instrument of someone else's confrontational policy. At the same time, it is with warmth that we remember our previous cooperation. There were unique projects of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation in environment, joint expeditions in the Arctic 2006 and the Antarctic 2009. There were regular cultural exchanges. We have many years of experience of mutually respectful dialogue. We have great historical and spiritual legacy joining our countries together, and they should not be relegated to the past. They have to help rebuild that legacy and cooperation for the sake of Russia and the Principality of Monaco. The time will come when what is happening with Russophobia in Monaco will cease to exist. I think the whole of Monaco has come to understand what kind of a monster they have reared with their own hands by arming and encouraging the terrorist activities of the Kiev regime. Another anniversary, but more joyful, as it were. On July the 16th, we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Treaty on Good Neighborliness, Friendship and Cooperation between Russia and the People's Republic of China, signed in Moscow 2001. This document is the foundation upon which, for 25 years, Russia and China have been building and deepening our strategic cooperation and partnership. It has enshrined such principles as lack of territorial claims, non-interference within domestic affairs, non-use of force, mutual respect. This respect for sovereignty is in stark difference to the rhetoric that some Western countries are trying to impose on Russia and the world. The Russian-Chinese practical cooperation is steadily developing with an emphasis on this big treaty demonstrating sustainability and adaptation to global challenges. We keep building our bilateral cooperation on the principles of equality, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. Started from 2001, our trade has grown more than 20-fold, and for many years in a row, it has been superior to $200 billion. I would like to remind you, China is our greatest trade partner. We pursue a number of projects in energy, industry, transport, high-tech, and space. Our bilateral investment is growing, just as our cultural and humanitarian cooperation last year with great success. We completed our cross years of culture. 2026, 2027 have been declared Russian-Chinese years of cooperation in education. We have good dynamics in academic mobility, which creates a favorable environment for training highly qualified personnel. We increase our inter-university cooperation. We have a joint Russian-Chinese university in Shenzhen on the basis of Lomonosov Moscow State University and the Beijing University of Technology, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Our tourist flow is growing in two-digit numbers now that certain categories of our citizens, in particular tourists, enjoy a visa-free regime. Our close contacts are certainly facilitated by this visa waiver. Moscow and Beijing are coordinating closely in the UN, BRICS, the SCO, other international platforms on building a just world order on the basis of multipolarity, indivisibility of security, equality, and mutual respect. A special article will mark the anniversary, an article by Foreign Minister Lavrov in the newspaper Kommersant, a prominent fixture amid cardinal changes for the 25th anniversary of the Russian-Chinese Treaty on Good Neighborliness, Friendship and Cooperation. Very soon this article will appear in print. An important humanitarian initiative. In July this year, a large-scale Russian world project will be completed to equip 60 educational universities in Tunisia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina with equipment the Russian-speaking schools, 60 of those. They've been provided with textbooks and other help in June, July, with the support of our embassies. The Russian classrooms have been equipped with textbooks, with books, laptops, tablets, electronic blackboards and screens, projectors, and equipment, including furniture for schools. And on June the 18th, the capital of Tunisia, the ambassador Alexander Zolotov attended a celebration for the official handover of equipment and literature to 18 schools. This action has been supported by the Foreign Ministry as well as the Education Ministry of the Republic of Tunisia. On June the 30th, Esidorsi College Serbian School in the city of Shaikash saw the handover of equipment and literature for 16 Serbian schools. And July the 1st, the same ceremony took place in Gymnasium number 8 in Belgrade. July the 2nd, National Library of Banja Luka in Bosnia-Herzegovina got textbooks for 27 schools studying Russia. The Minister for Education and Culture of the Republic of Srpska spoke there, and other officials. More than 103 educational institutions in the Republic of Srpska study Russia and Russian literature. This pilot project shows the importance of our humanitarian support for primary and secondary education. The equipment handed over by the foundation will make classes more interesting, more substantive, and modern educational platforms will be used. The foundation keeps expanding this initiative, and it'll also help steer more than 60 educational institutions in Tunisia, Serbia, and the Republic of Srpska. More than 60 schools will be under their patronage. The foundation will also help with the training of specialists. And another humanitarian project, our foreign ministry and the Russian railways keep expanding their successful cooperation in the field of humanitarian diplomacy. A great tour in the Russian north is going to be organized for the young leaders from abroad. It'll take place from July the 15th to the 21st. This project is taking place in pursuance of the Russian humanitarian policy concept. It demonstrates our tourist and cultural potential. This trip will allow the guests to familiarize themselves with our unique cultural and natural legacy. They will see the infrastructure of Archangel, Belomorsk, Vyborg, Murmansk, Petrozavodsk, Kortevala, and Teribrka. Leaders of 10 countries will be participating in this project. And another ceremony, which is currently being prepared in Paris at UNESCO headquarters.
On the 17th of July, on the sidelines of the Global Conference of the International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development, there will be an awards ceremony for UNESCO Russia Mendeleev International Prize in the Basic Sciences. The ceremony will be attended by the Minister of Science and Higher Education of Russia, Valery Falkov, as well as UNESCO Director General Khaled El-Anani. The prize was awarded to Professor Pan Zhenan, the University of Science and Technology of China, for the pioneering contributions to secure and large-scale quantum communications, as well as to Professor Sergei Sheiko, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, the U.S., for prominent achievements in fundamental physics of polymers and materials science. The decision was adopted by the UNESCO Director General building upon the recommendations of the international jury, and the prize is funded by the government of Russia. The overall prize fund is $500,000. It is awarded for pioneering discoveries that contribute to social and economic transformation and the development of international and regional cooperation. The Mendeleev Prize seeks to raise awareness of the discoveries of this great Russian scientist and to highlight the role of fundamental sciences and the importance of international interaction in addressing the most dire global problems of today. It is a very important ceremony and event. However, it is marred by the fact that they do not allow it to be properly covered in the media. And you don't even know what kind of bullying our Russian journalists are facing. The French government refused a journalist from TASS agency, refused a visa, who was sent on a mission to cover the political life in France. These very days, there's been court proceedings of another journalist. She was doing her journalist work, Madame Novikova, in Paris, in France, and we call on the French authorities to live up to their commitments. We call on UNESCO, as well as its secretariat and the relevant bodies and agencies, to give a proper assessment to this flagrant facts when the freedom of speech is violated. Another interesting date, 17th of July, marks 150 years since the birth of a prominent Soviet statesman and diplomat, Maxim Litvinov, who made a significant contribution in the development of the Soviet diplomatic service. Throughout many years, Litvinov occupied responsible posts in the foreign agency of our country. In 1920, he was appointed as a representative of the Russian Soviet Republic in Estonia. In 1921-1930s, he was Deputy People's Commissioner for Foreign Affairs. He participated in the work of important international conferences and events, including the Genoa and the Hague conferences of 1922. In 1930-1932, he was the head of People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs of the USSR. In 1934-1938, he represented the USSR in the League of Nations, where he championed the principles of international cooperation, the equality of states, and norms of the international law. The contemporaries marked his principled approach and his ability to firmly defend national interests and the readiness to constructively engage in an international dialogue. These principles echo Russian diplomacy, as well as the words of Mr. Litvinov that he said at the session of the League of Nations in 1935, "The world is indivisible. It's high time to recognize that there is no security in one's own world and peace and security if the peace is not secured for neighbors from afar and the closest one." One of the most important stages of his activities is the development of relations between the USSR and the USA. During the Great Patriotic War, Mr. Litvinov was Deputy People's Commissioner for Foreign Affairs. From 1941 to 1933, he was ambassador of the Soviet Union to the U.S. At the same time, from 1942 to 1943, he was envoy of the Soviet Union to Cuba. He made a significant contribution to the development of cooperation of the anti-Hitler coalition states. At all his responsible posts, he proved to be a talented diplomat, a seasoned negotiator, and his professionalism, his in-depth knowledge of international relations, and personal contribution helped him gain wide recognition both in the Soviet Union and abroad, and for many years of service he received the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, and many other state awards of the USSR. We pay tribute to Mr. Litvinov and his contribution to protecting national interests of our country in the international arena. On the 17th of July, a marker organization, upon the initiative of the Russian Foreign Ministry, will issue a state postage stamp. We suggest that all those who are interested in the foreign policy of Russia to study the materials that are published at the Historical and Documental Department of Russian Foreign Ministry. I'm talking about the electronic exhibition dedicated to the major stages of life and diplomatic activities of Mr. Litvinov. And another unique gift that we'll present to all of you, we actually got it from indifferent people, historians, collectors, people who are related to diplomacy. Not so long ago, the Foreign Ministry received as a gift the collection of photos, archive photos that are related to the diplomatic activities of Maxim Litvinov, and we will do our utmost to ensure that on the 17th of July, the social media accounts of the Foreign Ministry will publish the pictures, the photos, and certainly the physical photos will be transferred to the archive of our ministry. I can also say that there were a lot of questions regarding the preparation to the election to the State Duma abroad, and we'll definitely publish the relevant material currently provides information on various aspects of this matter. We'll publish this on our website and on our social media accounts. With that, I'm ready to take your questions. International Life, are you here with us? Madam Zakharova, good day. Hello. Recently, the EU Council on Foreign Affairs announced a decision to cover the EU sanctions, to cover a number of individuals and companies, including VK Holding, that is the operator of Messenger Max. And this was caused by the tracking and helping track oppositioners in Russia. How would you comment on that? I think that everybody already got used to the fact that the EU and the collective West does not even bother searching for some logical grounds behind these illegitimate unilateral restrictions. Therefore, well, this looks insane, but it doesn't look more insane than previous sanctions. This is groundless, just like previous measures that are taken because of our, so to speak, interventions, cyber attacks, hacker attacks, and other crimes against these flawless democracies. If we talk about the practice, we can state that Brussels once again showed its pathological desire to do its utmost to stand in the way of our citizens in the West who has some kind of affinity to our country, or simply to those who want to learn news from Russia and not through some mediators who uses Russian services. This approach has nothing to do with genuine democracy or this care for human rights or desire to ensure the interests of their own citizens. It has nothing to do with that. It is at odds with the commitments that these countries undertook in information space. We clearly see this anger and chronic Russophobia. All these sanctions can hardly make any impact on the development of this national messenger, but for the EU bureaucracy it is much more important to try to do everything to discredit the resource that it does not control, to try by hook or by crook to undermine trust to this resource. Russia has its own all-weather digital ecosystem. It does not depend on fluctuations in the West, And this is something that triggers irritation, which is manifested in various discrimination acts, legal, commercial, and regulatory aggression. Not so long ago, we have commented on the fact that the VK apps were deleted from App Store, and the Apple company made reference to some kind of sanctions against the holding, although they forgot that there were no restrictions against this company that were introduced by the US. They went as far in their lies. Back in the day, Obama used to say that, well, we were talking about referendum in Crimea, but according to Obama, the only right referendum took place in Kosovo. And according to Obama, this was the example, the exemplar of referendum. But one thing is distorting reality in the administration of Liberal Democrats. The other thing, those who came to power under the banners of fighting this liberal democratic distortion of reality, we didn't expect this from them. But let me repeat that all these attacks against Russian internet venues and companies only make us believe that there is no alternative to building a sovereign national digital framework. And this is a warning to all those states who ponder whether it would be a good idea to make Western companies in charge of their digital infrastructure, or they should be less trusted as they build their own sovereignty by themselves and counting on those who never deceived them. If you have no further questions, News Frank. Hello, I can hear you loud and clear. Madam Zakharova, if I may, I have two questions. The EU started negotiations on Ukraine accession for 2 out of 6 negotiating clusters, according to Minister on European Affairs of Ireland. What is Russia's take on such EU intentions, given the attacks by Ukraine on civilians and civil infrastructure of Russia, and regular demands of EU representatives to take part in negotiations on Ukraine with Russia? Basically, any decisions by the EU regarding Ukraine, they are always announced with grandeur, and they are always politicized and confrontational in their nature. That shows you the current state of the EU. They profess this consumers' attitude of to the values that they advance. And basically, it speaks a lot about the expansion policy. Obviously, the key role in implementing this policy is played not by the fact whether the candidate is in line with the criteria, but they're just purely geostrategic considerations. In less than a month after the first negotiating cluster dedicated to the functioning of the law, the EU decided to open another cluster, and this is quite emblematic, since now we're talking about foreign policy, security and defense cooperation, as well as countering hybrid threats. They gave a green light to these negotiations, and basically they agreed that as they recognized de facto, Kiev is in line with the initial criteria. And by doing so, the EU approved the military and terrorist means used by Kiev, despite the fact that lately the Kiev regime has mounted increased attacks on the civilians and civilian infrastructure in the Russian Federation. And the EU makes no reference to the human rights, the freedom of speech and democracy. They forgot it all at once. And in any of such recent high-profile cases, for instance, barbaric attack on the college in Starobelsk and the destruction of a regular passenger bus from Moscow to Simferopol, an attack on a bus carrying kids from the Gomel region, a terrorist attack using drones in the market in Tokmak. These were not condemned, but there were not even words of support to the families of victims. There were no words that we have heard. And this silence speaks better than all the statements by ministers, European commissioners calling some kind of to ensure some kind of peace and their demands to put them at the negotiating table. That's their genuine, the way they treat people, actually. And a second question, if I may, sure. President Trump of the U.S. stated that right now Washington has a small portion of land in Ukraine. Now we have land in Ukraine, we have mineral resources, and it became known that Trump intends to support sanctions against Russia to put pressure on Russia during negotiations. Given that, what is Russia's take on the U.S. desire to put pressure, talking about possible negotiations, and can we draw a conclusion that the West needs negotiations only to just to allocate Ukrainian territory to themselves? It's clear that, well, one Zelensky says that he would not abandon Ukrainian lands, and the other Zelensky is handing out these Ukrainian lands to anyone. They should clarify whether he hands it out, whether he presents it as a gift. The most important thing is for them to understand that all these vows, all these pledges and calls for this forced Ukrainian mobilization under the pretext that they should protect the Ukrainian land, all this is actually going on against the backdrop of providing this portion of land for further use by those who have no relation to them whatsoever. It's not a secret for us that the West used Ukraine as a geopolitical barraging ram against Russia, and at the same time they have their eyes on the richest lands and natural resources of this country. That's what we've been warning you against. They try to get their hands on this land, or simply they want to exchange it for loans. Not loans, but interest rate on loans. Or they will simply take it completely. Any kind of deals of such kind, and hopefully I hope that this is something that the citizens of Ukraine realize, because many of them have been brainwashed, and this has nothing to do with the care for sovereignty and prosperity of this country, let alone peaceful conflict settlement. Ukraine should play the role of a colony that will pay for its debt at the expense of future generations, including using its own land and the population. Thank you.
Yes, Soyuzny TV channel, are you with us? Yes, good afternoon, Irina Rezibova. The Polish Defense Ministry has launched military exercises in Voitrod ships next to Kaliningrad region of Russia and Grodno and Brest regions of Belarus. Warsaw has called on the citizens not to place on the internet any photos on the transfer of equipment. What's Russia's take on Polish exercises next to the borders of the Union state. Indeed, the Defense Ministry of Poland has published an announcement of military exercises next to the borders of Russia and Belarus on July the 13th and 14th. We believe also it wants to flex some muscles to climb one step higher to the coveted stages of the leader of Eastern Europe, as well as the main rampart of NATO's east flank, amid the growing tensions in the region brought about by irresponsible actions of the collective West that has provoked and keeps escalating the conflict in Ukraine. The flare-up of military activity of the armed forces of Poland next to the borders of Russia and Belarus is another sign of lack of responsibility of the Polish elite. Yes, Izvestia, please. Yes, thank you. Is Moscow planning to start discussions about the Strait of Hormuz at the UN Security Council, given the risks for the global supplies of energy? The Strait of Hormuz, the US strikes against Iran, and the reciprocal strikes of Iran against the American presence in the region, that is the spotlight. That is where the spotlight is right now. And the last one, the last meeting was on July the 14th about the Red Sea. Russia has spoken about lack of any alternative to diplomatic settlement. The agreements that have been reached with the mediation in the format of the Islamabad Memorandum have been reached, and they have to be built upon. A favorable environment has to be created for diplomacy, and we, for one, stand ready to make a contribution of our own to these efforts. And I've also described the overall situation in my preliminary remarks. RT channel, are you with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Yeah, day in, day out, we see the progressive degradation of the Western diplomacy. Is there anything we can come to an agreement with them with? You know, we shouldn't be speaking about the degradation of Western diplomacy. We have to talk about pseudo-diplomacy of the West, when under the guise of diplomacy, they are basically resorting to other destructive forms of influence, which, rather than compromise or an agreement, or in compliance with agreements, seek to use international legal instruments that were set up after the Second World War for the sake of legitimizing their own crimes. One could say this is a degradation, but I would rather call that pseudo-diplomacy, the degeneration of diplomacy into a quasi-diplomacy. Provided there is a genuine interest in that, there is always some latitude for maneuver, unless, as long as there is a genuine interest. But as you know, the contacts with the West, with the EU, that is something we did not abandon. It was them who abandoned those contacts. They blocked themselves from any contacts with Russia. Back then, they said this was the policy of isolating our country they were pursuing, but it turns out they've isolated themselves from us, whereas the world majority never followed suit. We have always spoken in favor of addressing any diplomatic differences via diplomatic means. We also speak in favor of mutually beneficial relations with all countries, even when the registry of unfriendly regimes has been adopted. We have been emphasizing that these are regimes we're talking about, regimes suffering from Russophobia and taking actions against our country and our people. We have always emphasized that this has no bearing on the people, on the citizens, who are often victims and hostage in these countries to the policy their respective regimes are pursuing. The resumption of dialogue with European countries could only be launched once they have ceased their unfriendly and sometimes even aggressive Russophobic actions against our country, provided they fully abandon the anti-Russian cause and abandon the interference within the domestic affairs of our country. This is basically the starting point for discussing any arrangements whatsoever, and this is something that was mentioned before on multiple occasions by the Russian leadership, and in particular by the president, by the Russian foreign minister. As far as the premises go, you see, there is no premising right now. I've cited some examples. Right now, I think there are no preconditions. The EU have lost the skills of diplomacy as well as the skill of engaging in equal dialogue, and we see that they share the same attitude towards what they call the savage jungle. They believe themselves to be the garden of paradise. They never listen to others. They do not know how to find compromise. And even their ability to enter into treaties is something that is called under question, but because right now their policies are determined by ambitions and phobias by certain political statesmen and Euro bureaucrats, and all of that is done under the influence of NATO. If that is all, we've got Sputnik with us, right? Yes. Hello, Madam Zakharova. Sputnik Radio, the Western media are moaning the fact that once Lindsey Graham has died, Kiev has lost one of the most influential lobbyists in the U.S. Do you agree that Lindsey Graham, he was officially declared terrorist and extremist in Russia, was basically irreplaceable ally of the Kiev regime, or do you think his role was exaggerated? You know, we've got this Russian adage, either you speak well of the dead or you speak nothing of them, but, you know, this is not the full statement. Either you speak well about the dead or you say only the truth about them. What can we say but the truth? We can only say that he was declared terrorist and extremist in our country. During his recent trip to Kiev, he said that killing Russians was the best investment. This is a direct quote, so I do not think this is something, his demise is something that Russians should be mourning or speaking with sympathy about. We are humanists, and this person thought the whole people, with its history, with so much suffering, was to be destroyed. You know, I gave you the quote. I think this is something that has to be in the spotlight. How did it happen that this ideology was used? Why did this person enjoy the hospitality of countries that thought themselves to be civilized countries? How was he working in the US, which is so sensitive with regard to tolerance, to human rights, and to compliance with the relevant norms and regulations? I will emphasize once again, he was calling for killing Russians. We fully realize that this competition of clinical Russophobia was in vogue. He took the baton from McCain. Probably someone else will take up the baton of this Russophobia, maybe someone in the capital, someone else. We'll live and see what happens next. I think this is the aspect we should be focusing on. How do people with this mindset, with this philosophy they were promoting, a philosophy which is absolutely in line with Nazism, with racism and xenophobia, how could these people make it to the highest levels of power in countries who believe themselves to be civilized nations? Thank you. Thank you. Do we have the Chinese Media Corporation here? Yes, Madam Zakharova, we've got one question, or rather two questions in one. Recently, 14 countries, including the US and Japan, have spoken in favor of the so-called arbitration on the South China Sea, but most who signed it have no relation to this region whatsoever. I would like to remind you that back in 2016 at the G20 summit, Vladimir Putin supported China's position on the inadmissibility of that ruling. So my first question is as follows. Does this arbitration ruling has any bearing? Does it have any legal standing? And what's Russia's take on the interference of extra-regional players? And secondly, why cannot this arbitration ruling be seen as a legitimate mechanism for settling such disputes from the Russian point of view? I would like to remind you that Russia has been sticking to a firm position on this arbitration ruling on the South China Sea. We have always spoken about the following elements: the need to search for political and diplomatic solutions to settle any differences, in particular the declaration of the conduct of parties in the South China Sea of 2002, non-interference of ex-regional forces and the settling of this problem, the non-recognition of legitimacy of the arbitration ruling due to the lack of consent of China to this ad hoc arbitration. I would also like to remind you that on September the 5th, 2016, speaking at the press conference of the G20 summit, President Putin underscored that this was not a political position, rather it was a purely legal position, because it requires the consent of a country for the difference to be handed over to an arbitration chamber. And as is known, China did not participate in this arbitration proceedings because it firmly holds that this arbitration did not possess the requisite jurisdiction. In general, the problem of stepping outside their jurisdiction for international tribunals is something we do not find something new. Russia has had to face a legal war unleashed on us by the West, in particular in the issues related to international law of the sea. Reuters, please. Yes. Good evening, Madam Zakharova. We had a question about President Macron's statement on the multinational forces for Ukraine and the forthcoming military exercises and their deployment in Ukraine, but you have already responded to this question. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Do we have Newsroom with us? Madam Zakharova, yes. We've got two questions for you. The first one is related to France and to the summit of the Coalition of the Willing that you mentioned. We are trying to understand where this militarist zeal of Macron's come from, his willingness to deploy troops. Is there going to be competition between Paris and Berlin, because London was the one who was most active in that regard? And what is Russia's take on Macron's previous statements and his militarism? You know, to an extent, I've already responded to this question when I commented on this get-together of the Coalition of the Willing. But I will add to that a French detachment participated in the parade and at Champs-Élysées, and the armed military forces of the Ukraine participated there, which shows that the Europeans are resolved to escalate and to continue confrontation with Russia. This militarist zeal of Emmanuel Macron, which you have mentioned, is the manifestation of the course taken by the current European elites in power who want to deter our country and to deal a strategic defeat to Russia. Over the recent years, not the French people, not the country of France, rather the regime that is currently in power at the Palais d'Élysée has become one of the greatest instigators of Europe's militarization. And they are basically donning the outfit of the party of war, as it were. They have also spoken about handing over the licenses for the production of missiles to Kiev. This is yet another example of what is happening. One should be laboring under no illusions. The French are not going to and fro from the talks and back to the conflict. I think their position is absolutely clear, their choice is clear. All hints at talks should only be viewed as an attempt at imposing ultimatums on Russia. The ultimatums coming from the coalition of the West, or trying to secure a reprieve for the Ukrainian armed forces to rebuild their strength, to replenish their forces and continue their terrorist attacks. Paris is not ready to search for a negotiated solution, and that is why it is not ready to take into account our interests. We see no sign whatsoever that they are in favor of peace. They have given a blank check to the people in Bankovaya, and to these hands, which are covered with blood, they have given arms. And these people, they participated in the terrorist attacks against the civilian infrastructure in Germany. These very same people participated in the attacks on civilians in Kursk region. The very same people carried out strikes against sleeping children and young people in Starobelsk. These very same people are pursuing terrorist attacks from Africa to Monaco, and was clearly involved in that terrorist attack. So France is also given missiles and money to these hands covered with blood. What kind of peace can they talk about? And our second question, it's more peaceful. In compliance with the presidential decree, a citizen of Belgium, Pierre Leclerc, has become a citizen of Russia, has been granted Russian nationality. Does the Russian foreign minister has any special programs to invite highly qualified experts from the Western countries? How attractive is Russia to such real accounts from European countries? For many compatriots who reside right now in European countries, Russia is becoming increasingly attractive as a place of relocation, because people can get back to the cultural, linguistic environment they've been accustomed to. They can provide their children with education in the native language. They can rear their children in respect for historical memory and traditional spiritual values, something which is normal, not the new normal we can see elsewhere. In those countries, they have ended up they're being persecuted due to their language, due to their religion, due to their nationality. The Russian Foreign Ministry has been advocating this. I hate to dwell on that, but you know that very well. We've always spoken in favor and of these people. We've tried to protect them. We provide them with legal support. We recommend legal counsel to them with the in cooperation with our partners. We try to help them protect their rights in international platforms. We draw the attention of the international community to these cases, and those who believe it is no longer possible to them to stay abroad, especially in Western Europe, they always have the chance of getting back to their historic motherland and get the assistance. There is the legal foundation that has been created specifically for these purposes. The ministry does not operate a separate program that would be aimed at attracting the highly qualified specialists only from the Western countries, but on December the 2nd, 2025, the President of Russia signed Decree number 883 on the support of relocation to Russia of foreign citizens and citizens without citizenship if they represent a particular interest to Russia and on their legal standing in Russia. This document has entered into force on April the 15th, 2026, and it seeks to facilitate the relocation of highly qualified specialists to Russia. These are people who can get assistance if they have a highly sought-for profession, they have achievements in sport, creative industries, manufacturing, education.
And now this document has been up and running. Besides that, we have a special mechanism for creating favorable conditions for the relocation of the foreigners, and hence we have the relevant document of the 19th of August 2024, order number 702 on providing humanitarian assistance to people sharing traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. This decree provides for providing to foreign citizens or persons without citizenship from countries that are included in the list of foreign countries that implement the policy that impose destructive neoliberal ideology that are at odds with traditional Russian spiritual values, providing them with one entry visas up to 3 months to come to Russia. And there is the relevant decree of the Russian government of the 17th of September 2024 to facilitate the presidential decree to streamline and to enhance assistance measures to relocated citizens. We continue the work of the headquarters to implement the decree of the Russian president of the 18th of October 2024. The office has developed and adopted the relevant action plan, and the responsible agencies and interested organizations are implementing it. There is the relevant leaflet for those who are coming to Russia. It describes all the stages that need to be undertaken in order to come to Russia. It also has the information regarding the geography of our country and cultural diversity. We'll provide the relevant links. We are ensuring information assistance to implementing a package of measures that seeks to help citizens with their relocation to Russia. And we make use of the whole tool set of media tools, including briefings, interviews, and official statements, as well as digital diplomacy tools. Over the past 2 years, the foreign citizens show high interest to moving to Russia. The decree allowed many foreigners not only to get a second home, but also helped build an image of Russia as a country with attractive conditions for life and work, as a custodian of traditional spiritual values. For those who seek asylum from aggressive imposition of this destructive narratives. There is also the state program to provide assistance to relocating compatriots to Russia, compatriots that have been living abroad. This program has been implemented since 2007, and overall 1,230,000 people have moved to Russia using this program. That is the main tool that ensures the moving and adjustment of compatriots to Russia, given social and economic interests of Russian regions. 79 regions of Russia have regional programs. They address housing issues, finding jobs, professional training. They provide legal assistance and social welfare support. In a nutshell, that's it. The topic is quite extensive, and the colleagues will provide you with all the links to the documents that I have mentioned, and we will publish it on our website. Thank you so much. To also receive, I may be wrong in pronouncing it. Madam Zakharova, hello. Gorgia Jurashvili from Georgia. At the outset, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to be part of your briefings, and thank you for this chance to ask your question. You are always welcome. Thank you. I would like to say that that is no exception for anyone. This is a chance for all journalists from all countries that have the relevant document that they are journalists, even those who are not accredited to the Foreign Ministry. They have a chance to participate in our briefings. Thank you. Prime Minister of Georgia, Mr. Kobahidze, accused the OSCE and European institutions of attempt to forcefully take power in the country, to seize it by force. And does the Foreign Ministry agree with such an assessment? Can we say that the OSCE has turned into from a tool of security to a tool of political pressure? I believe that the words of the Prime Minister of Georgia do not need our confirmation. We're talking about a leader of a sovereign state that knows his country, that loves his country, and that represents its people. That's one thing. Secondly, if we talk about international relations and the agenda that has to do with sovereignty, independence, non-interference into domestic affairs, modern Georgia is the example of unscrupulous, unprecedented interference into the affairs of a sovereign state. Tbilisis' aspiration to stick to an independent and nationally guided policy guided by the interests of its own people, that is multi-ethnic, and this is perceived by the West as a challenge and as something that irritates the West. And it irritates it in such a way that they could use any leverage to oust the unfavored authorities simply because they serve the interest of their own people, because it thinks about its own people, it knows the history of its people, and it is building its policy guided by that, and not guided by the people who have nothing to do with the history of Georgia and its people. By the looks of it, the statements by Prime Minister of Georgia that you are talking about have to do with the adoption of the Hague Declaration at the annual session of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. It includes a number of resolutions, and I'm sorry to quote that, but it has to do with undemocratic election in Georgia. And the same declaration has a resolution on Ukraine condemning Russian aggression, as they put it. What is that? Well, this is just something that they came up with. This is the destructive attempts by the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly that come as no surprise to us. The OSCE Parliamentary Assembly have opted for the destructive actions for a long time. They refuse an interparliamentary dialogue and cooperation between the OSCE member states. And due to that reason, on the 3rd of July 2024, our country decided to suspend the participation of the delegation of the Russian Parliament in the work of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And so far, we do not see any reason to get back to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Getting back to the OSCE at large, indeed, unfortunately, it lost the unique toolbox of preventing and settling conflicts within its space, which could come in handy today. At the same time, a number of states use the OSCE venue to criticize and chastise not only Russia but also other states by using the so-called Moscow mechanism, which is outdated, non-consensus tool of the OSCE to monitor commitments undertaken by member states. Or when it comes to Georgia, such mechanism was launched on the 29th of January this year under the pretext of, and I quote, degrading, and we put it in quotes, in brackets, the degrading situation in human rights and unfulfilled commitments in human dimension. End of quote. I would say one thing. If this had any relation with human rights, these people would be bothered about the perishing and the killing of children in Starobelsk, for instance. We would see some kind of press statement from them, or at least a tiny declaration on their behalf. Something. Just some kind of an announcement in social networks. But no, this was a deliberate killing of children in a campus, in a college, and it provokes no emotion. But we're talking about a flagrant violation of human rights. And in this case, what can we talk about that? What can we talk about in this case? And when it comes to Russia, they launched this mechanism since 2022, and they did it 8 times. They did it 3 times against Belarus in 2011, 2020, and 2023. Have they instituted this mechanism against somebody else? I have cited you examples when such mechanism could have been invoked, but no. For us, these conclusions of the Moscow mechanisms are legally null and void. Thank you. Thank you. Let's move on. Ukraine.ru. Are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. Thank you for this opportunity to ask a question. Today we talked a lot about escalation by the EU. How would you comment on the statement by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres? He once again strongly condemned Russian strikes in Ukraine. And that is happening against the backdrop of unceasing Ukrainian attacks against Russian civilians and civil infrastructure. Well, he decisively condemned of alleged Russian strikes on Ukraine, but I probably think that he talks about strikes against civilians, and this shows double standards by the UN Secretariat that is led by this Portugal citizen. If the Secretary General is concerned about this dangerous trend to escalation and a growing number of civilian casualties, or where's the condemnation of strikes by the Ukrainian armed forces? For instance, strike against the college in Starobelsk. Where's the condemnation of a terrorist attack against a bus that carried Belarus children in the Bryansk region, or an attack of the residential house in Yegoriyevsk where a 6-month-old infant died? Where's the response on the data that was sent to the UN Secretariat regarding attacks of the Kiev regime against civilians in the DPR, LPR, Belgorod, Kursk and other regions? Where is it all? Has he said anything at all about that? Shame on him. Over the past 2 weeks alone, the Ukrainian armed forces issued 10,000 strikes on civilian facilities that affected over 600 persons, including 23 children. Ukrainian drones daily hunt on civilians. They strike medical facilities. They strike passenger trains, and they strike medical workers. However, the Secretariat make it seem that it doesn't know about these facts, or it simply mumbles that it stands for everything good and against everything bad. But when they have to support something bad, they find words to do that. That is a shameful position that shatters the UN credibility even more. It has already been undermined due to the words of Guterres and the likes. The strikes of the Russian armed forces against the military infrastructure of Ukraine, that is a response following the terrorist attacks of the Kiev regime against our country. As President Putin has stated, our response will be proportionate, and the enemy will always feel it. Thank you. Vesnik Kavkaza, are you here with us? Hello. Madam Zakharova, I have the following question. One of the initiators of the 3+3 platform, President Aliyev, at the Shushan Media Forum, stated that the forum should deal with the problems of the whole region, not just Azerbaijan and Armenia. It should develop multilateral cooperation with clear agenda. From the Russian viewpoint, what is the agenda for the 3+3 platform? Let me remind you that it encompasses Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. It was established in 2021 to address the regional issues by the states of the region and close neighbors. They are the ones who are interested in peace and security in South Caucasus. The agenda of the platform was developed during the three meetings of foreign ministries in Moscow in 2021, in Tehran in 2023, and Istanbul in 2024, and it is universal in nature. We're talking about interaction, broad range of multilateral cooperation issues, including transport, energy, culture, combating new threats and challenges, and bilateral issues are not to be discussed within this platform. Well, this format has a different agenda. We expect that Baku and Yerevan will agree on the sequencing of the next meetings of foreign ministers. Let me remind you that there was the relevant agreement following the Istanbul session at the first expert session of the 3+3 platform, which took place on the 5th of June on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in 2026. The participants actively spoke in favor on focusing on specific win-win economic projects without politicization, and we fully share such an approach. If you have no further questions, Embassy is live. Are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. Dear colleagues, Embassy is live. What is Russia's take on the establishment of a European coalition on missile defense? Is it a defensive initiative, or is it a factor that could change the military and political balance in Europe? On the one hand, the initiative to establish the so-called Europro is not something new. At the same time, despite the mottos of some kind of European strategic autonomy, including the Germany-sponsored project Celestial Shield, in one way or another they become part of the integrated NATO ABM system, which is basically the segment of the global US missile defense system. We have repeatedly mentioned that this initiative has destabilizing repercussions. Suffice it to remind you that we are not talking about purely defensive steps, because building anti-missile entities are considered by the US and its allies as a paramount element to get the dominant military and strategic preemptive role over any enemy, including Russia, as they put it. On the other hand, something new is the attempt by Western NATO countries to engage Ukraine into their missile defense project, and we believe that that is another step to drag the Kiev regime into an all-NATO military paradigm and to the relevant entities of the North Atlantic Alliance. I believe that there should be no further comments on our side. NATO tries to devour Ukraine in a geostrategic way, and this was one of the root causes of the current crisis and the special military operation conducted by Russia. Any attempts to formally, or as they sometimes say, informally dragging Kiev into the interaction models to the military bloc that is enemy to Russia, these attempts are unacceptable and they will be repelled by our country.
Thank you. Russian Vector. Do you have Russian Vector with us? Good evening, Madam Zakharova, Russian Vector, Tatiana Plotnikova. The German ambassador was told by the foreign ministry that Berlin had participated in the terrorist attacks of Kiev against civilian infrastructure in Russia. He was told that it was inadmissible that Germany should keep supporting the Kiev regime. The U.S. is all too supplying the Kiev regime with intelligence, weaponry, and communications. So how can the Foreign Ministry of Russia express its protest to the U.S. Now that there is no American ambassador in Russia? But, you know, the embassy is still there. Moreover, we've got contacts at the highest level, and there are contacts between the embassy here and our Russian embassy with the State Department in Washington. I think this question is somewhat far-fetched. There is a great number of different forms of channeling our protest and expressing our concern, and it's not centered around the ambassador. And, you know, there are different reasons for ambassador not being there. He can be revoked, he can be on holiday, sometimes he's not yet appointed, but is always a chargé d'affaires. So I do not quite understand why the need to formulate this question at all. But Washington knows our position very well, and he supplies of weapons to the Kiev regime, unfortunately turned the supplier into an accomplice in terrorist activities. Unfortunately, that is the case right now. So this is not just an involvement in the conflict, which is something we spoke about from the very beginning. This is also direct support of terrorist activities. Thank you. Do we have the voice of Motherland with us? Yes. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We've got one question. You've spoken about the Strait of Hormuz today, but we would like to clarify the fees, the tariffs that the U.S. wants to levy. Will it apply to the Russian merchant fleet, and how do we ensure the security of our vessels? As of now, there are different statements broadcast via the media, and they're very controversial, and they're mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're assigned either to the countries of the Persian Gulf, Iran, Oman, Saudi Arabia, to extra-regional such as the US and countries of Western Europe. Some of them include the demand for free-of-charge transit, the establishment of a fund which will levy the tolls for search and rescue, for ensuring the safety of navigation, and there are different cross-references. So right now I would be loath to give my assessment to the veracity and accuracy of these statements, because they are all very controversial and they contradict one another. We believe the imposition of tariffs on transit through international water thoroughfares would contravene international law of the sea. And as far as our merchant fleet is concerned, this is our priority, and we are in contact with the relevant authorities in the relevant organizations on this matter. Thank you. If there are no more questions, then I would like to bid you goodbye. Until next time we meet in our briefing, I'd like to wish all of you all the best. And we would like to remind you that we swiftly give response to your questions. We provide comments on an everyday basis, sometimes 24/7. So all the best to you.